She watched him pour the last of the coffee and walk out of the kitchen without offering her any. Her jaw tightened. A small thing, but the resentment arrived instantly, sharp and familiar, like a splinter you stop trying to remove. The bitterness did not come from the coffee. It came from months of small things, a long, quiet ledger of disappointments she had never named aloud. By the time she set her cup in the sink, a cold story had already formed in her mind. He does not care enough to notice what I need. That story felt completely true. This is the hidden architecture of resentment. It is not simply anger. It is often the bitter aftertaste of a request that was never spoken. We begin inside a familiar fracture. One person feels deeply wronged and increasingly distant. The other person feels vaguely guilty, but cannot identify the crime. The obvious explanation points outward. He should have offered. He should have remembered. A caring person would simply know. That is the first answer, and it feels so justified that many of us never look further. But psychology invites us to pause. If we do not look further, we mistake the feeling of justified anger for the whole picture, and we miss the quiet cost at the center of the pattern. Resentment is often described as a reheated anger, an old hurt that simmers on low. The word itself comes from the Latin for to feel again. Something is resensed, relived, replayed in our private theater. Unlike a flash of rage that cools, resentment is a slow accumulation. It gathers around a core expectation that has been disappointed, not once, but repeatedly, often without the other person ever being told that the exam was happening. When we look at resentment honestly, we often find an unspoken need living at its heart. Not a preference, not a wish, but a need that we have been carrying silently, hoping someone else will see it without us having to ask. That is the first turn. Resentment feels like a verdict about someone else's failure, but it may also be a symptom of our own unexpressed longing. That does not excuse neglect, but it changes what is possible next. To understand how this works, we have to look at what a need really is. A psychological need is not just anything we want. It is a requirement for our sense of safety, connection, respect, or autonomy. Some needs are obvious. We need food, water, shelter. Others are relational. We need to be taken seriously, to be included, to feel that our efforts are noticed, or to receive comfort when we are hurting. We do not always know how to state these needs directly. For many of us, a direct request feels vulnerable. It is like handing someone a map to where we are tender and hoping they do not walk there with heavy boots. So instead of asking, we hint. We do extra things for others, hoping they will reciprocate. We go quiet, hoping our silence will be interpreted as pain. We drop clues and then feel crushed when the clues are not found. This is sometimes called the expectation of mind reading. We want a person who cares to just know, because if we have to ask, the care might feel less genuine. It is a trap we set for the people we love, and for ourselves. Return to the woman in the kitchen. She had needed to feel considered, to feel that her presence and her tiredness were visible to the one person whose attention mattered most. That is a deeply human need, but her need was wrapped inside a silent test. If he does not offer, it proves he does not care. That test created a trap he could not escape unless he could read the invisible question she was asking. The first research that helps us here is not a single famous study, but a consistent findings across relationship science. Unexpressed expectations are a stronger predictor of dissatisfaction than almost any other factor, because they guarantee that solutions will not be found. When needs remain unspoken, any fulfillment becomes accidental, and disappointment becomes inevitable. The math is brutal. If you do not say what you need, the odds of getting it approach zero, except by luck. So we must ask, if the cost of silence is so steep, why do people hold on to it so fiercely? This is where the psychology deepens, and where the obvious answer begins to crack. For many, asking directly feels dangerous. As children, we may have learned that needs were met with annoyance, dismissal, or punishment. We learned that being low maintenance brought love, while having needs risked rejection. These lessons often do not stay in childhood. They grow into an adult voice that whispers, "If I have to ask, I am too much already." And so we swallow the request and the bitterness begins. There is another reason silence feels safer. Asking gives the other person a clear chance to say no. A silent hope is never officially refused. It can remain a permanent maybe, and that maybe protects us from a wound we do not know how to survive. But the body and the mind keep score of those swallowed requests. They do not vanish. They transform into a heavy, quiet resentment that says, "You should have known." This is the second turn. Silence is not passive. It actively produces the hurt it aims to prevent. Psychologically, we can describe this as a self-protective strategy that backfires. We withhold the request to avoid immediate conflict or the pain of refusal, but the unspoken need festers. The relationship pays a higher price later. And here is a crucial finding from couples research. When partners keep score secretly, the resentment grows even when the actual behavior of the other person does not change. The story we tell ourselves about their debt becomes more vivid with every new entry. The unfairness of this is not just a moral idea. It is a practical one. Resentment often punishes the other person for a failure to perceive something we refuse to communicate. The punishment is usually coldness, withdrawal, or little stings of sarcasm. From the outside, this can look baffling. One person is hurt and pulling away. The other person is confused and defensive. Neither can name the original need because it was never a shared fact. It was a private hope. At this point, we have to complicate the picture. Not every resentment is self-inflicted. Sometimes a person does ask, clearly and repeatedly, and is ignored. That is not unspoken need. That is neglect. Do not confuse the two. So we are looking at a specific kind of resentment, the kind that grows in the space between what we expect someone to notice and what we tell them we need. That space is not just silence. It is a room built of old fears, past learning, and cultural training. Others are taught that asking for something emotional is weak. Boys are often told not to cry, not to need comfort, not to ask for reassurance. They grow into men who cannot say, "I am hurting," and who express that unspoken pain as irritability and distance. These are not personality flaws. They are learned patterns of need suppression. And when you suppress a need long enough, it does not disappear. It comes out sideways, often toward the very person you most wish would see you. Now consider the brain's role, not as a cause, but as a participant. When we perceive a social threat, like the possibility that someone does not care, our body's stress response activates. Cortisol levels can rise. Our attention narrows. In that state, we become worse at perspective taking. We interpret neutral actions as neglectful. A rushed morning becomes proof of a ruined relationship. Resentment narrows our ability to see the full range of possible explanations for someone else's behavior. That creates a dangerous loop. We feel hurt, so we scan for more evidence. We find it because our biased attention picks up every ambiguous cue as confirmation. We add more to the ledger. The resentment hardens. This is what psychologists call hostile attribution bias. It is the tendency to interpret unclear actions as intentionally hurtful when you are already in a negative emotional state. Resentment is both the fuel and the product of that bias. But here is a detail that often gets missed. The other person is not merely a victim of our bias. They are often reacting to our coldness, our sarcasm, our withdrawal. They sense the anger but cannot find its source. When confronted with unexplained resentment, a common human response is to become defensive. "What did I do wrong?" is asked. But when the answer is a cryptic "you should know," the conversation breaks. Both people end up alone in the argument. The third turn is this. Resentment is not just a feeling we hold. It becomes an interaction pattern. It trains the other person to walk on eggshells they cannot see, and it trains the resentful person to believe that their silence is the only safe option. This brings us to a painful paradox. We stay silent to preserve a relationship, yet that very silence erodes the connection we are trying to protect. The need does not go away. It just sits between the two people like an invisible wall they keep bumping into. Let us return to the woman with the coffee. After she set her cup down, she did not say, "I really needed some coffee this morning, and I felt hurt when you poured the last of it without asking." She gave a tight smile and said nothing. He noticed the tight smile. He did not know what it meant. He felt a flicker of irritation, then a small withdrawal of his own. By lunch, they were eating on opposite sides of the room, and neither could have explained why the morning felt so heavy. This is how unspoken needs shape whole afternoons, whole weekends, whole years, not in dramatic eruptions, but in the quiet accumulation of moments that were never clarified. The resentment becomes the weather of the home. Now ask the older question. Why is speaking a need so terrifying for so many of us? The answer often lies in our history of attachment. If early caregivers were unpredictable, dismissive, or punishing when we expressed a need, our nervous system encoded a warning. The warning says, expressing a need leads to disconnection or danger. So we adapt. We become experts at needlessness. We tell ourselves we do not require much, and we take pride in being easy, undemanding, and self-contained. But that adaptation comes with a shadow. We still have the needs. They leak out as resentment toward people who are not fulfilling them, people who never had a fair chance to try, because the terms of the relationship were never fully shared. Psychologists who study emotion regulation distinguish between suppressing an emotion and reappraising it. Suppression means hiding the outward sign of the feeling while the inside pressure builds. That is what happens when we swallow a need and smile. Surface suppression often backfires. The person suppressing feels more inner distress, not less, and the person on the other side picks up the tension, but cannot decode it. The gulf widens. Reappraisal, by contrast, means changing how we interpret the situation, but we cannot reappraise a need we refuse to acknowledge. If we never admit, "I need to feel important to you," we remain stuck with the raw hurt and the fake calm. The research on mind reading in couples reveals a consistent pattern. Even in long-term relationships, partners are poor at guessing each other's unspoken thoughts and needs. Love does not grant telepathy. It grants motive to try, but the trying still requires signals. And here is another uncomfortable finding. People who score higher on measures of what is called unexpressed entitlement, the belief that others should automatically know what they need, are measurably more dissatisfied in relationships and trigger more conflict. So we approach the central reversal. The resentment that felt like righteous proof of another person's failure begins to look like something more complex. It begins to look like a signal that we have been hiding an important part of ourselves. That does not make the hurt invalid. It does not turn the other person into the hero. It simply means that the cycle of resentment depends as much on our silence as on their inattention. And silence is something we can begin to observe. Now we must face the deepest contradiction. We are often most silent about our needs with the people we most fear losing. We believe that if we ask, we will be revealed as too much, and the relationship will end. So we protect them from our needs by hiding them. But the irony is devastating. The relationship does not end from the asking. It ends from the silent, accumulating resentment that the asking was meant to prevent. The protection strategy destroys the very connection it wants to save. This is where the story of the woman in the kitchen reaches its most honest point. She had been protecting him from her disappointment for months. She had been protecting herself from the risk of hearing, "not now." But the protection had turned into a slow, cold corrosion. The climax of this exploration is not a single study. It is a shift in viewpoint that decades of clinical and relational research support. Resentment is often a form of undeveloped request. It is pain that has not yet found its words. When we treat resentment as purely someone else's fault, we stay powerless. They must change. We wait. We punish. But when we see it as a signal of an unspoken need, we gain a small, difficult piece of power. The power to speak. Let me say this carefully. Speaking a need does not guarantee it will be met. That is the risk. The other person may not have the capacity or willingness, but silence guarantees only one thing. The need will remain unmet, and the resentment will grow. The reversal is this. The exit from destructive resentment often begins not with the other person suddenly noticing us, but with us noticing the fear that keeps our voice locked. The real change is inside the person who decides to stop hiding. This is not a quick fix. If you have spent years or decades swallowing your needs, the first attempts to speak will feel awkward, terrifying, and possibly inarticulate. You may stumble. You may overcorrect and become demanding instead of clear. But the psychological research on assertiveness shows that clarity about needs, delivered without accusation, tends to reduce resentment over time, even when the initial conversations are uncomfortable. The simple act of naming a need can reduce its internal pressure. Think of what changed for our woman in the kitchen. Not the coffee, not the morning. But what if, later that day, she had said, "I need you to know I felt invisible this morning, not because of the coffee, but because I need moments where you notice I exist." That sentence is terrifying to speak. It exposes her, but it also offers him a map. Without the map, he had been walking through a fog of tight smiles and mysterious silence. With the map, he could choose to respond, to repair, or at least to understand. Of course, sometimes speaking does not repair. Sometimes the other person genuinely does not care, or cannot meet the need. And that is deeply painful. But even then, your clarity allows you to make a real choice about the relationship, rather than staying trapped in an invisible cage of hope and bitterness. The psychological term clarity is important here. Clarity does not mean the feeling goes away. It means the need is now a visible fact between two people, not a hidden wound inside one. That alone can reduce the obsessive mental replay of the hurt. This is the climax. Between the silence and the request lies the entire territory of resentment. The silence is a choice that feels like safety but becomes a prison. The request is a risk that feels like exposure but can become a pathway out. The dramatic question we set out to answer was, why can an intelligent, caring person become more certain of being unloved while the evidence against them remains invisible to everyone else? The answer is now visible because the evidence was never shared. The resentment was not a lie. The hurt was real, but the story that the hurt proved the other person's deliberate failure was incomplete. The silence had turned a need into a secret test, and the test was designed to be failed. Now the meaning of that first moment in the kitchen changes. It is no longer a simple case of a selfish man and a hurting woman. It is a complex system in which two people are trapped, one by unexpressed needs, the other by a lack of actionable information. Two people can live next to each other for years, share a bed, share a kitchen, share a life, and still be speaking different languages when it comes to the deep, quiet needs that never found words. That is not a failure of love. It is a failure of communication. And communication is not just talking about the schedule or the bills. It is the risky, repeated practice of saying, "Here is what I need to feel safe, valued, or close to you." It is the practice of revealing the expectation instead of tallying its disappointment. It means asking yourself a quiet but sharp question the next time you feel that familiar sting. What is the need I am not naming? What is the request I am afraid to voice? Can I even put it into words for myself first? You may not be able to answer that question immediately. The need may be buried under layers of old training and fear. But the simple act of asking it begins to shift your attention from the other person's failure to your own internal signal. And that shift is not about blaming yourself. It is about recognizing that resentment is a messenger. It is your psyche ringing a very loud bell. The message is not simply, "they are wrong." It is often, "something in me is waiting to be expressed." That is the earned insight. The pain of resentment is a signal of a need in exile. When we learn to read it that way, the bitterness can begin to transform into something more navigable. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity creates different choices. Now, let the tension release into a practical reflection. When you find yourself keeping a silent score, try writing down exactly what you wish the other person would notice or offer. Not their flaws, but the specific unmet need beneath your hurt. Then, when the emotional charge has settled a little, ask yourself, have I ever stated this need in words they could understand, at a moment they could hear it? Or have I only expressed it through silence, sighs, and hoping they would guess? If you have never spoken it, consider one small experiment. Choose a moment of calm, not a fight, and say a version of the truth that focuses on your need, not their failure. I need a minute to talk out something that is hard for me to say. That is the door. This is not a guarantee. The response may be disappointing, but the experiment changes something inside you. You stop being a prisoner of an invisible expectation. You become a person with a voice, even if that voice trembles. But what if, instead, she turned around later, when the tightness in her throat loosened, and said, I need to tell you something. It is not really about the coffee. It's about feeling invisible. Can we talk tonight? That changes nothing and everything. He might be defensive. He might be confused. He might, for the first time, see a door he did not know was closed. He might say, I didn't realize, tell me. And if he does, a new process begins. If he does not, she still gains the dignity of having spoken her need. The psychology of resentment and unspoken seeds leaves us with a difficult truth. Intimacy is not built on guessing games. It is built on the slow, brave, often clumsy practice of revealing our inner world and inviting someone else to see it. That revelation will always feel vulnerable. There is no way to eliminate the risk. But the risk of silence is greater. Silence guarantees distance. It guarantees that your needs will remain a secret burden, and that resentment will grow in the dark. We do not owe everyone every need. Some needs are ours to meet alone. But in our close relationships, withholding a core need is like holding your breath and blaming others for the fact that you are suffocating. The body will demand air. The psyche will demand expression. And expression is not an attack. It is not a demand that someone fix you. It is simply the act of making your inner state known. I need a moment of quiet. I need to feel that my work is seen. I need to know you still like me. These are not weak statements. They are the sound of a person who has decided to stop hoping for a mind reader. They are the sound of someone choosing honesty over the false safety of silent expectation. And honesty, even when it stings, is the only ground on which real connection can stand. Notice that we never said the other person's behavior did not matter. It does. But the resentful person's silence was the lock, and the key was always in their own pocket. That is not blame. That is the beginning of agency. When you see the pattern clearly, you can start to notice it in real time. You feel the sting, you name the buried need to yourself, and you decide whether this specific relationship is safe enough for you to risk a quiet, honest sentence. Not a demand, a revelation. And if the relationship cannot hold your honest needs, that is painful but clarifying information. It is better than a lifetime of hoping for a different person and resenting the one you have. Clarity is not cruelty. It is the foundation of choice. So the next time you feel that old, familiar bitterness rising, pause. Ask what need is hiding behind it. The answer will not make the hurt vanish, but it will point you toward the only door that leads out of the cycle, the door marked Speak.